The cardiac monitor screamed a warning just as Brigadier General Harold Fitch hurled the blood pressure cuff across the room, and Nurse Elara Voss caught it against her chest without flinching. "Get out," he snarled, his voice a grinding rasp of gravel and old authority. "Get out and send me someone who knows what the hell they're doing. Not another soft-handed girl who learned medicine from a textbook." Elara set the cuff down on the supply cart. She did not respond. She simply looked at him the way you look at a storm, acknowledging it, waiting for it. The charge nurse on the morning shift at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center had warned her before she walked through the door of room 308. Brigadier General Harold Fitch, retired. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Traumatic brain injury from a vehicle rollover outside Mosul in 2006, now presenting with acute kidney failure and dangerously elevated blood pressure that he was actively refusing to let anyone treat. He had already sent 2 nurses out in tears. He'd thrown a cup of ice water at an orderly. The on-call physician, Dr. Sasha Nguyen, had retreated from the room 14 minutes ago and was currently standing at the nurse's station rubbing her temples with both index fingers. "He won't let anyone touch him," Dr. Nguyen said quietly when Elara had arrived at the desk. "He's in hypertensive crisis. If his pressure spikes again before we get the labetalol in, we're looking at stroke territory." "I'll go in," Elara said. Dr. Nguyen looked at her with the cautious expression of someone watching a person volunteer to defuse a bomb. He's not kind, Elara." "I've noticed unkind before." She had pulled his chart before walking down the hall. She always pulled the chart. It was her habit, the same way a pilot does a walk-around before takeoff, checking every surface for something the previous crew might have missed. She read through the medical history, the medication list, the allergies, and then she had reached the military service section and paused. 3rd Infantry Division, 2nd Brigade Combat Team, Mosul, Iraq, 2004 through 2006. Elara stood very still in the hallway for a moment. Then she closed the chart and walked to room 308. Now she stood inside the room, the blood pressure cuff in her hands, General Fitch glaring at her from his hospital bed with the specific fury of a man who had once commanded thousands and could not bear being reduced to a paper gown and a saline drip. "I said, get." He pointed at the door, his hand steady despite the visible effort it took. He was a large man, broad-shouldered even in illness, with a white buzz cut and a face that looked as though it had been left out in decades of wind. His eyes were pale gray and absolutely furious. "What branch are you from? Because you clearly weren't taught how to follow a direct order." "I'm from room 308, Elara said evenly. "And your blood pressure is 198/112, which means you and I are going to have a very productive morning whether you want to or not. I want a male nurse. I want a military physician. I want someone who has actually been in a field hospital and not some suburban clinic handing out Tylenol to people who stub their toes. Do you understand me? Do you have any idea how many times I've had incompetent people poke at me with needles in this building?" Elara set the cuff on the edge of his bed with a deliberate click. "I understand that you're in pain, General. I understand that you have been in this hospital for 11 days and that no one has adequately explained to you why your kidneys are behaving the way they are. And I understand that being in a bed when you're used to standing is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have." She looked at him steadily. "I also understand that if I don't administer this medication in the next few minutes, we are going to have a significantly worse conversation in about an hour when Dr. Nguyen is calling your next of kin." Fitch stared at her. His jaw worked. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that." "I'll take that as a compliment." She reached for the IV line. "Give me your arm." "No." He pulled his arm back, tucking it against his chest like a child protecting something precious. "I don't know you. I don't trust you. I don't trust any of the people in this building. They poke, they prod, they scribble on clipboards, and not one of them has looked me in the eye and told me the truth. So you want to earn the right to touch me? Tell me something true. Tell me why my kidneys are failing and don't give me the pamphlet version." There was a beat of silence. Elara pulled over the rolling stool and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. "Your kidneys are failing because of chronic NSAIDs used layered on top of the contrast dye you received during your cardiac catheterization in 2019, compounded by the hypertension that has been poorly controlled for approximately 8 years. Your body has been compensating for a long time, General, and it has decided it is finished compensating." She paused. "That's the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in the ferocity of his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not softening exactly, but adjusting, recalibrating. "And the prognosis? Dialysis is likely. Transplant is possible. Both of those futures require your blood pressure to come down today." Fitch was quiet. The monitor beeped its steady warning. Outside in the hallway, a gurney rattled past, and someone laughed briefly at the nurse's station. "Fine." He held out his arm, rigid, reluctant, but held it out. "Make it quick." Elara worked efficiently, swabbing the port, checking the line. As she connected the medication drip and began adjusting the rate, Fitch stared at the ceiling with the expression of a man actively choosing not to be where he was. "How long have you been a nurse?" he asked, not looking at her. The question had the tone of a man filling silence more than seeking an answer. 7 years here, Elara said. "Before that, I was a combat medic, Army, 68th 9th Medical Brigade." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it had a different texture than the one before it. Fitch turned his head and looked at her. For the first time since she had entered the room, his gray eyes held something other than contempt. 68th? You were forward? Camp Liberty 2011 through 2012. Mosul General Support Medical Company Detachment, the last year. She kept her voice neutral, calibrated, clinical. After that, Fort Campbell. Then I got out. He studied her face with the sharp, involuntary assessment of a man who spent 30 years reading people for survival. You were in Mosul. I was in Mosul. Another silence. Fitch turned back to the ceiling. His jaw was tight, the muscles in his neck working. "That was a bad year," he said finally. The words came out rough-edged and bitten short, the way people say things that cost them something. "Most years in Mosul were," Elara said. She finished setting the drip rate and stood, collecting her supplies. She was nearly at the door when Fitch spoke again. "My aide, Captain Del Vecchio. He was hit outside the Yarmouk traffic circle in 2006. Convoy rollover. I was in the vehicle when it flipped." He stopped. Elara stopped. "He didn't make it to the hospital. He died at the scene. They told me the medic on site did everything possible." He was not looking at her. He was staring at the window, at the flat gray morning pressing against the glass. "I'm sorry," Elara said. And she meant it the way you mean things that don't have adequate words, simply, without decoration. "Do you know what it is?" Fitch said slowly. "To go 30 years without knowing the name of the person who was kneeling next to your man when he died? Without being able to find them, to ask them, to—" He stopped himself. His throat moved. "They said it was a female medic. Young. That's all I ever got." Elara stood at the door with her supply tray and said nothing. She left. By midday, the labetalol had brought Fitch's pressure down to 162/94. Significant progress, though not enough. Dr. Nguyen ordered a second agent added to the protocol and asked Elara to go back in for afternoon vitals. The hallway outside room 308 was quiet at 1400. The lunch carts had been cleared. A television murmured from one of the rooms down the wing. Elara stood outside the door for a moment, not hesitating exactly, but pausing. The way you pause before stepping onto ice you haven't tested yet. She pushed the door open. Fitch was sitting up, He had pulled the IB pole close and was reading something on his phone, squinting at the screen. He did not throw anything. He did not speak. He watched her cross the room and set up her equipment with the wary tolerance of a large animal deciding whether to move. "Pressure check," she said. "I gathered." She wrapped the cuff around his arm. He held still, which she noted as progress. "Better," she said, reading the display. 158/90. He grunted. She noted it on her tablet. The room was quiet except for the monitor. Outside the window, a flag on the hospital's main building moved slightly in the cold November air. "I've been thinking," Fitch said abruptly. He was looking at his phone but no longer reading it. "About what you said this morning. That you were in Mosul. 68th Med." "Yes." "The Yormuk Circle incident. October 14th, 2006. Do you—" He stopped. His thumb moved against the phone screen. He wasn't a man who stopped easily. Elara could see that, and the stopping cost him. "Were you on that route?" The monitor beeped. Somewhere in the hospital, a door closed. Elara stood at the side of his bed with her tablet in her hands and very carefully did not move. "General," she said, "were you en route Senators that morning?" The question was not quite a question. His voice had dropped into something that was no longer the sharp command register he'd used since she arrived. It was quieter, careful. The voice of a man who had spent a long time not asking something and was finally asking it. Elara set her tablet down on the bedside table. She looked at Harold Fitch, at the rigid, enormous, diminished man in the hospital bed. The man who had thrown a blood pressure cuff at 7 a.m. and was now holding very still. And she made a decision. She reached up to the sleeve of her scrub top, her left sleeve. She pushed the dark blue fabric up past her elbow and turned her forearm so the underside faced him. The tattoo was not decorative. It was not the kind of ink people got at a parlor on a weekend night with their friends. It was dense and deliberate, a caduceus intertwined with a black combat cross, the rod of Asclepius overlaid on the crossed rifles of the Army Medical Department. Below it, in small blunt military lettering, 68W, Combat Medic Specialist. And below that, in a script slightly different from the block lettering above it, the coordinates. Numerals only. No place name, just latitude and longitude. The exact location of the Yarmouk traffic circle. Fitch stared at the tattoo for a long time without speaking. "I got them after I got out," Elara said. Her voice was steady and low. "I got the coordinates because I needed to remember exactly where I was, not what it felt like. I already knew what it felt like, but the precise fact of the place, so I could carry it without losing it." Fitch's face had done something complicated and was working to undo it. "You were there," he said. "I was en route Senators. My team was third in the convoy. When the lead vehicle went over, we were out before it stopped moving." She was quiet for a moment. Captain Del Vecchio was in the front passenger seat. He had a traumatic aortic injury. Even in a trauma bay with a full surgical team, the odds would have been— She stopped. "We did not leave him alone. I want you to know that. He was not alone." Fitch's hands were pressed flat against the mattress on either side of him as if bracing against something. His knuckles were white. His jaw was working in the tight, suppressed way of a man who has held something back for so long that the holding is the only thing keeping the structure upright. "He talked," Elara said, softer now. "At the end, he was in and out, he said. He said to tell his father that he made rank. That was what he said. Tell my dad I made captain. Like that was the thing." She paused. "I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget the exact words." The sound Harold Fitch made was not quite a word. It was something that had been living behind his sternum for 18 years and had just been handed an exit. Elara did not call for a colleague. She did not back toward the door. She pulled the rolling stool close to the side of his bed and she sat down, and she let the man grieve. She had learned that early, at Camp Liberty, at the forward aid station, in the back of every Humvee-turned ambulance she had ever crouched in, that sometimes the most sophisticated medical intervention available was simply staying in the room. Fitch cried without covering his face. It was a specific kind of crying that Elara had only seen in combat veterans and in people who had been given very bad news. Total and unself-conscious, the kind that comes when the body overrides the part of the mind that is still managing appearances. He cried for Patrick Del Vecchio, and probably for other men too. Men whose names Elara didn't know. Men that 18 years of command and stoicism had compressed into a pressure that his failing kidneys and overworked heart had finally run out of room to carry. When it passed, he sat with his eyes closed for a long moment. Elara waited. "He was 26, Fitch said finally. His voice had a scoured quality, emptied and raw. 26 years old, knew the name of every man in the unit. Every single one. I used to tease him about it. I said, 'Del Vecchio, you're a walking roster.' He said, 'Sir, these are the people who are going to have my back in a ditch. I intend to know their names.'" Elara smiled slightly. "That sounds like a good officer." "He would have made colonel." Fitch opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. "He would have made general, maybe. He had that quality. You can't teach it. Either a man has it or he doesn't. He had it." "I believe you." Another silence, but different now. The pressurized quality was gone. The room felt like a space that had been evacuated and was slowly being refilled with regular air. Fitch looked at Elara. His gray eyes were red-rimmed and clear. "Why didn't you say something this morning?" "Because this morning you were ready to hear it." He considered this. "And you knew that?" "I've been doing this a while." He looked at her arm, at the tattoo still visible below her pushed-up sleeve. "The coordinates," he said. "You carry it. Every day." He was quiet again. Then, slowly, his attention shifted to the IV line running from the pole into his arm. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's been fighting that he's finally decided to stop fighting. "The dialysis," he said. "Is it... What does the process look like?" Elara straightened slightly on the stool. This was new ground. She had not been able to get him to discuss treatment options for 11 days. 3 sessions a week, typically. 3 to 4 hours each. There are centers throughout the DC metro area, or we can arrange home dialysis if you have support at home. My daughter is in Arlington." He paused. "She's been calling the floor every day. I told the nurses not to put her through." Elara said nothing, but she noted it. "She worries the way her mother used to," Fitch said, and his voice had shifted again, not grief exactly, but the particular tenderness of a man who is aware he has been unkind to someone who didn't deserve it. "She flew in from Portland when they admitted me. I told her to go home." He stopped. "She didn't go home." "I know," Elara said. "She's in the family waiting area on the 2nd floor. She's been there since Tuesday." Fitch looked at her sharply. "You spoke to her?" "She introduced herself when I came in for the early shift. She wanted to know how you were. I told her your vitals were being managed." Elara kept her voice neutral. "She brought a blanket from home, the one from your living room. She thought the hospital would be cold." Something moved through Fitch's expression that was difficult to name. It was not quite shame, but it was adjacent to it. "She brought the blanket," he repeated. "It's at the nurse's station. I can have someone bring it up." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands. They were large hands, scarred across the knuckles. The hands of someone who had spent decades outdoors in difficult conditions. They were trembling faintly, a side effect of the medication, and he was looking at them as if taking inventory. "I wasn't kind to her," he said, "when Margaret died. I wasn't." He stopped. "I didn't know how to be in a house without Margaret in it, so I stopped being in the house." Elara did not offer a platitude. She waited. "You know what a soldier does when he doesn't know what to do with a feeling?" Fitch said. It wasn't quite a question. He goes back to work, Elara said. He goes back to work. He nodded slow. 14-hour days, weekends. When they gave me the star, I was in the office by 0500 the next morning because I didn't know what else to do with it. He paused. She was 12 when her mother died, 12 years old, and her father was. I was present, technically. I was in the building, but I wasn't. He stopped again. She's here now, Elara said. Gently but directly. She's on the second floor with a blanket from your living room. Fitch looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the door. The silence stretched. Would you tell her, he said finally, would you tell her I said she could come up? Elara stood. I'll tell her myself. The change in room 308 over the following days was not dramatic or instant. It was the slow, incremental kind of change that looks like nothing from close up and like everything when you step back. Fitch allowed his vitals to be taken without argument. He allowed the dietary adjustments Dr. Nguyen ordered. He took his medications on the schedule posted at the foot of his bed. He was not warm exactly. He was a man who had been built in a particular shape over many decades, and that shape did not include warm, but he was cooperative, and occasionally, when Elara came in for her rounds, something that might generously be called courteous. His daughter, Renata Fitch, was there every morning by 8. She was 31 and had her father's gray eyes and her mother's, apparently, everything else. Dark hair, easy laugh, a habit of bringing the staff coffee that Elara suspected had been calculated to smooth the path. She pulled up a chair beside her father's bed and read while he slept, and when he was awake, they talked with the halting, overly careful speech of two people relearning a language they had both partially forgotten. It was not easy, but it was happening. One afternoon, Elara came in to check the drip rate and found Fitch showing Renata something on his phone. Photographs, it looked like old ones from the desert. He was explaining something, his voice low, his finger moving across the screen. Renata was leaning in close. She had her hand on his forearm, just resting there, lightly, the way you touch someone you are afraid to lose. Elara adjusted the drip rate and left quietly without interrupting. On the 10th day after the morning Fitch had thrown the blood pressure cuff, Dr. Nguyen cleared him for transition to outpatient dialysis. Renata would take him to Arlington. A center 10 minutes from her apartment had an opening in their Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday schedule. It was, Nguyen noted, a best-case scenario. Elara was finishing a chart at the nurse's station when Fitch appeared in the hallway. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a dark button-down pressed trousers, a wool coat that looked like it had cost more than Elara's first car. He was walking with a cane, which he used with the stiff dignity of a man who had recently made peace with needing it. Renata was beside him, their luggage at her feet, talking to the discharge nurse. Fitch came to the counter. He set something down in front of Elara without preamble. It was a challenge coin, not uncommon in military circles, but this one was old, worn smooth on the edges, the raised relief on both faces buffed almost flat by years of handling. The emblem on the front was the 3rd Infantry Division crest. On the back, barely legible, 2nd BCT, Rock of the Marne, and beneath that a date. 14 OCT 2006. I've carried that since the day of the accident, Fitch said. He was not looking at her with warmth. He was looking at her the way he looked at everything, directly, measuring. I had it made because I needed something to hold on to and I didn't have. I didn't know who to give it to. He paused. Now I do. Elara looked at the coin on the counter. It was silver, or had been silver once. Now it was the color of old pewter and had the specific weight of a thing that has been in a pocket every day for 18 years. General, she said. Patrick would have liked you, he said. He had a weakness for people who didn't take any nonsense. He would have said you had sand. A beat. He used to say that about people he respected. I never quite understood where he picked it up. Elara picked up the coin. It was warm from his hand. He picked it up from the first Cav guys at Camp Liberty, she said. She had heard Del Vecchio use it. She had heard him use it exactly once. In the 30-some minutes she had known him, had heard him say it to a junior medic who had kept working through shelling that made everyone else flatten to the earth. She had never forgotten it because of what happened 40 minutes later. Fitch stared at her. Something in his gray eyes broke open. He said it, Fitch said. It was not a question. He said it. The general stood in the hallway of Walter Reed with his cane in one hand and the other hand pressed against the counter, and he breathed. Just breathed. The way someone breathes when they have been given back something they had stopped expecting to find. Dad. Renata appeared at his elbow, glancing between him and Elara with the quick, attentive look of someone who has learned to read a room. The discharge paperwork is done. We can go whenever. She stopped. Dad, are you okay? I'm fine, Fitch said. His voice was rough-edged but stable. He straightened. His hand moved from the counter to Renata's shoulder, and he kept it there, just resting. The way she had rested her hand on his forearm in the hospital room. And she went very still, as if moving might disturb something that had just, delicately, landed. He looked at Elara. Thank you, he said. It was not an elaborate speech. It was a man who had spent a career issuing commands of great complexity, reducing himself to the simplest 2 words in the language, and meaning every syllable. Elara nodded. Take care of those kidneys, General. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the structural possibility of one. I'll see what I can do. Renata took his arm. They walked toward the elevator, the luggage rolling behind them. Elara watched them go. At the elevator, before the doors opened, Fitch turned back once. It was a brief look, not sentimental, not prolonged. Just a look that confirmed something. The doors opened. They stepped in. Elara turned back to her charts. The coin was in her palm. She held it for a moment, its worn edges familiar against her fingers, though she had only held it for 2 minutes. The way certain things feel immediately known. Then she set it in her breast pocket, close to where the name badge clipped, and went back to work. The ward was full. There were other rooms, other charts, other people in difficult beds who needed someone to stay in the room with them. That was the work. That was always the work, and she had not yet found a good reason to stop doing it. I keep thinking about the moment Elara set that blood pressure cuff down on the edge of Fitch's bed. She didn't slam it. She didn't argue. She just set it down with a quiet click and waited. That one gesture has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this story, because it tells you everything about who she was and about why things turned out the way they did. There's a cause and effect running underneath everything that happened in room 308, and it's not complicated once you see it. Fitch spent 18 years carrying a weight that was destroying him from the inside out, and his body was finally keeping score. The kidney failure, the blood pressure crisis, the inability to let anyone help him. None of it appeared out of nowhere. It was the accumulative result of a man who had learned to manage every hard thing by going harder, working longer, feeling less. That works for a while. It works right up until it doesn't. And then there's Elara. What she did wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was the direct result of choices she had been making for years. To stay in the room when things got difficult. To read the chart carefully instead of just the obvious symptoms. To carry her own history without letting it make her brittle. She had every reason to walk out of room 308 the moment Fitch threw that cuff. A lot of people would have. Instead, she stayed, not because she was a pushover, but because she had the kind of integrity that doesn't require an audience. She did the right thing when it was genuinely hard. And that's a different thing entirely from doing the right thing when it's easy. I think about what it takes to be that person. It's not one decision. It's 1,000 small ones, made mostly in private, mostly when you're tired. The decision to learn the right way instead of the fast way. The decision to keep showing up for people who aren't showing up for you. Elara had gone from a forward aid station in Mosul to a VA ward in Maryland, and somewhere in that journey she had built something inside herself that Fitch, for all his rank and his medals, hadn't managed to build. She knew how to sit with grief that wasn't hers and not flinch from it. That kind of steadiness doesn't come naturally to most people. It has to be earned, slowly, through exactly the kind of hard years she had lived. What moved me most was the moment Fitch asked her to tell his daughter she could come up. That was the real turning point. Not the tattoo reveal, not the medication going in. It was a general who had been unreachable for 11 days, making the smallest possible gesture toward the person who loved him and had driven from Portland with a blanket from his living room. The cause was Elara refusing to write him off as just a difficult patient. The effect was a father and daughter sitting in a hospital room, looking at old photographs together. That chain of events started with one nurse who decided to read the whole chart. I don't think the world changes through dramatic gestures very often. I think it changes through people who do the honest, unglamorous, genuinely difficult thing when no one is requiring them to, and who keep doing it until something finally shifts. Elara Voss had sand. I think that's worth remembering.